Hello and welcome. This is Jason Baker with Integrum Retro, and I have a question for you. How would you like a tool that will auto-configure MAME, Teknoparrot, and Demulshooter for all of your favorite Lightgun games? Well, stick around. I've got something to show you.
Shall we play a game?
A couple years ago, I released a video in which I was showing off a Lightgun drive that I developed that was based on a tool that I wrote that auto-configures all the emulators for every Lightgun on the market. In fact, I've been doing a heavy amount of development ever since. And so I've been an enthusiast for retro gaming for a number of years. It's kind of really made an obsession of mine. Now, I had to teach myself how to code in order to do this automation. In fact, I've always been trying to improve that experience, which is why I released these various educational videos, but I've also made it my own personal business now. So for example, if you go to integrumretro.com, you can see my new 4-player NV cabinet that I'm releasing. I also have a Lightgun cabinet coming out, and I've done a number of other high-end cabinets for various customers. So I'm really trying to take this experience to that next level. But throughout, what I'd like to do this time is introduce you to a new tool that I'm giving out for free to the community, and it includes the source code. So I'm going to break up this video in a couple ways. The first thing is I'm going to show you how the tool works. Then I'm going to show you how to configure the tool, and then I'm going to deep dive into some of the source code of the tool if you'd like to integrate it, tweak it, and use it yourself. It's going to be available here on GitHub. So let's start with a demonstration of how the tool works itself. The Integrum Retro Lightgun Assistant tool, say that 10 times fast, comes as a compiled executable. So what that means, you can just simply run that as a command before your game starts and when it stops. And the reason why you want to do it before is to configure the light guns and then stop to possibly clean up anything afterwards. So let me show you how this works. So you simply run the tool here from the command line. And the first thing you do, if you run it without any parameters, it's going to give me credit. Hey, please keep that in mind. I would appreciate if you do make any modifications, a little credit where it's due would be appreciated. But if you run the help command, it's going to show you the different command line options. So basically, your first parameter is going to be Lightgun. And with Lightgun, you can start something, you can stop something, you can list the Lightguns, and then you can configure some of the 3 emulators that I've defined. So that would include configuring Demulshooter, MAME, or Teknoparrot. Now the start and stop commands, we'll get into those in just a little bit. Those are specific to Sinden. If you're running Gun for IR, Aim Track, Retro Shooter, or BlamCon, you don't need to do the start and stop command. So let's go through a list of some of the different command line parameters and what they do. So here I'm going to type in the word Lightgun list, and nothing comes to the screen. The issue with AHK is you have to do pop-up windows. You can't do something that prints out to command prompt. But if you look here, it did create a log file. So if we go ahead and type that log file, you can see that it's detected my 2 Gun for IRs that are attached. Now what the tool does is it's going to assign an index order. So it's actually looking at the different hardware devices in Windows and determining which order were they plugged in. And that's going to be very important when you're working with 2 or more light guns. So what I do is the rule is simple. The first light gun you plug in is going to be considered index number 1. Now that's typically associated with player number 1. Now that's not to be confused with what the actual gun assignment may be. So for example, the index 1 first player was actually my Gun for IR player 2. So in the gun itself, it was assigned the ID player 2, but because I plugged it into Windows first, it will appear as player 1. If I want to fix that, all I have to do is unplug the guns and plug them back in the order that I would like. So now what I've done is I've replugged in the guns in the order that I want them to be assigned. So let's go ahead and run Lightgun list. We can look at the log file, and now you can see that it's been assigned in the right order, or the order that I wanted to. Okay, so now let's go ahead and configure some emulators. We're going to go ahead and start with MAME. So the way I would configure MAME is I would type in Lightgun MAME. Now, first, before I hit that, I want to show you what's actually going to happen. So controllers in MAME are assigned through a controller file. So if you take a look at your mame.ini, there's a section here called controller. And this specifies, well, what is the file name that we want to look at for our specific controller IDs? In this case here are light guns. So notice here that I have a single light gun. Looks like this is a Sinden ID. Now when I run the tool, I'm going to go ahead and run that here. you're going to see that this is now changed, and it is showing the two gunfry R's. And those two gunfry R's have been associated with gun code 1 and gun code 2. So that makes this very consistent. If I already have configuration files, which I'm going to offer on my GitHub repository as well, if they are already labeled GunCon 1 and 2, all I have to do is just simply assign the hardware IDs. So what does this look like in person? Let's take a look. So here I am in MAME Lightgun. I'm going to go ahead and load up Terminator 2. So MAME Term 2. All right, I got my two light guns. Bang, 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 bang. Let's go ahead and press start. Player 1, player 2.
It's Judgment Day.
All right, don't have the LEDs on, so as you can see here, player 2, player 1, bang, bang, 2. Oh, yeah. All right. Okay, so now that we've done that with gun for IR, I've plugged in a Sinden light gun, and there's one gun for IR. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to go ahead and run our configuration. So light gun, MAME, and then we are going to start the Sinden software. So light gun, start. You're going to see a little pop-up here. There's the Sinden software. So now the Sinden software is running as well as gun for IR. And then MAME term 2. Well, hasta la vista, baby. Okay, all right. So we've got a Sinden border, so it detected the Sinden, and we also have a gun for IR. So we'll go ahead and start player 1 first, which should be the gun for IR.
It's Judgment Day.
One. We'll just skip it. Oh, no, it's the Sinden, I guess. Okay. So here it is. So it's not tracking very well, lighting conditions. You know the Sinden works. Now we'll go ahead and press player 2.
Let's go.
Oh, that's the gun I unplugged. Here it is. I got too many guns. Alright. Sinden. Crack. Sinden. Crack. Together. Alright. You get the point. Okay, now that we're done, we can go ahead and stop the Sinden software. Light gun, stop. Now the reason why I show you all these commands is because you're going to make these a pre and post command in whatever build you're using or whatever front end you're using. So in this case here, we would run light gun stop after the game is over. Easy peasy. Okay, next let's go ahead and move on to Teknoparrot. We're going to assume we're just going to stick with the Sinden for this point. So we'll go into we'll run the tool again. And so just so you remember, we're going to run Lightgun Teknoparrot, and I'll get into why we might specify a game. So every game in Teknoparrot has its own XML configuration file. So this is why it's been tedious for most Lightgun users, because you have to go in and manually configure all the different configurations and buttons. But you don't need to now with this tool, because all you have to do is type in Intercom Retro Lightgun Assistant, Lightgun, and then Teknoparrot. And now you can see a pop-up that the file has been modified, and it's now pre-populated this with the Sinden Lightgun. So let's go ahead and start the game and see how it looks. So if we take a look here and load up the Teknoparrot UI, take a look at the controller setup, you can see here that it has assigned the Sinden. Now the Transformers game is a 2-player game, but because I've unplugged the other guns, you can see here it just kind of leaves these blank. So let's go ahead and start up the game. So we now know, at least Teknoparrot does know, that we have our Lightgun configured. Now I'm running in this windowed mode for easier recording. So here you're going to notice that it's actually recorded a border. Let's go ahead and turn off this border. And let me show you what extra step that Sinden users need to take. So in this case, I wouldn't be able to play the game because there's no border. Another feature of why we, specifically for Teknoparrot, when I run Teknoparrot, you'll remember there was a section where I can actually type in the word, I can type in a game name. So to create the border for Sinden users, basically when I configure Teknoparrot, I add one additional parameter. I'm going to add the name of the game. So where does the name of the game come from? Well, everything revolves around the Integrum Retro INI file. So in this INI file is where I define a lot of important items, such as what the Lightgun IDs are, Demulshooter configs, MAME, etc. So there's a section here for Teknoparrot. And this is where I define the reshade folders on a per game basis. So what you want to do is just copy everything up to the underscore reshade. And if you want to put up a border for that game, all you have to do is run the assistant.exe, Lightgun, Teknoparrot, and the name Transformers Human Alliance. So if I go and take a look at the reshade file, notice here under techniques, the border is missing, but just ran my automation tool, click yes, and now it's going to put the border back. So when the game starts, we will have a border. Okay, and there you go. Now the tricky thing is with Teknoparrot is sometimes you have to put the reshade files in the game folder. Sometimes you have to put them in the Teknoparrot emulator folder. So that's why I'll be releasing the Integrum Retro INI, which is kind of get you started, and it has all the pre-configured locations as to where these reshade files need to go. Now, finally, we have PC games. Now, for most PC games, if you want to utilize, especially two-player light guns or make them work with light guns, you're going to use a tool called Demulshooter. So the Demulshooter also has its own configuration file in which it will, you'll have to populate the IDs for your light guns as well. And you should know by now, how do you think you configure it? Well, it's just simply Integrum Retro Light Gun Assistant Tool, Light Gun, and Demulshooter. That's it. Now here you can see we have a notification that the Demulshooter config was changed, and there is our Sinden light gun. All right, so at this point now, whenever we need to run Demulshooter before something, it will work. Now, with all this, you can see that this tool is quite capable. How do you actually integrate it into your build? So I'm going to use LaunchBox as an example here. Let's go ahead and start with MAME. So say I want to auto-configure Area 51. One of the cool features of LaunchBox is it lets you run programs before and after. So under the additional app section, you'll notice I always have 3 different configurations. The first one is configure the light guns. So notice that we're calling lightgun MAME. If you remember, what that does is that populates the controller file with the light gun IDs. Next, I run start light guns. So this is basically running the light gun start command, and it's only going to actually do something if it detects a Sinden light gun. So that's responsibilities to start the Sinden light gun. And secondarily, or third, I should say, the stop light gun feature. Notice here that I'm running light gun stop. But something to point out here, notice I'm running this automatically after the main application. Configure light guns is running before the main application, but we're waiting for it to exit, right? We want to make sure that the config files are updated before LaunchBox starts to launch the game. The same goes with the start light gun portion, because there's a sleep factor where you have to wait for the Sinden software to start up. So make sure you tick the wait for exit button on both of those programs. Other than that, you're done. That's it. You rinse and repeat and do this for each of the different emulators. So even down when you look at Teknoparrot, let's go to, say, Transformers. Where you at? Should probably update the box art here. It's all different sizes. Okay, so under additional apps, configure light guns. So notice here I'm doing light gun Teknoparrot, but I'm also specifying Transformers Human Alliance. That's because on my drives, I actually populate the Sinden border, but you may not even have a Sinden or ever use one. So you can leave that off. It's not necessary. But if you do need to modify the reshade file, again, you look that up in the Integrum Retro config.ini. Okay. So those are the commands. Now, how do you configure this? Well, let's take a look at the most important file, and that is the Integrum Retro INI file. So how this is broken down, let's go ahead and just move all this to the side. So the first category here is light guns. The light guns, I'm going to list the VID and the PID. The vendor ID, which is usually a 4-digit number representing the hardware device, in that case it's Arduino, and the PID. So this allows the vendor to make different hardware ID products, and you'll notice they're usually incremented by a small number. So in this case, what I've done is I've assigned a description to each one of these VID, PIDs. So if you see one of these, it will actually show up as one of those, especially like in Teknoparrot as well. So I've captured as many light guns that are on the market today. If there's more light guns that come out, all you have to do, again, is just simply post in the VID and PID, and you can see that in action. One other thing I'd like to take a quick tangent is the fact that all of this is being logged. So if you type the Integrum Retro debug log, you can see everything that's happening. So when we're configuring Demulshooter, etc. I've also added another statement where if you type in the word debug, you're going to get even more verbose information about what's going on. So in this case, I guess there's nothing for Demulshooter. We might get something more for Teknoparrot. Here we go. So for example, when I run debug on Teknoparrot, it actually tells me what files it's actually updating. So you get a lot more verbose information when you add debug if you want to troubleshoot. So back to the Integrometro INI file. Now everything is built off of templates. So what we're doing is we're taking a template of what a config file should look like, and then we're just simply filling in the blanks, which is most often just the hardware IDs for the light guns. So first thing here for Demulshooter, I have the Demulshooter config file, so I'm pointing where that is. Now notice I'm using relative paths. So if you keep this really clean, in fact, this will be on the GitHub repository, you can just pretty much drag and drop and get started. So you would drop Demulshooter in this folder, make sure that it matches that name, or no spaces or anything like that, and the config file's in the root. Now what I'm doing is I've stored all the templates in the Integrometro folder, templates subfolder, and then of course based on the emulator. So the difference is this config.ini, let's go ahead and open that up. So we go into Integrometro, templates, Demulshooter, config.ini. Where'd you go? Oh, it opened it in the new tab. Here, let's move this one over. Here is the template folder. So notice that we're just simply taking a text string here. So triple # lightgun1, and we're replacing it with whatever lightgun IDs that we find. And the same concept for Teknoparrot as well. So when you go to MAME here, MAME's slightly different. First of all, we have to define where's that controller file that's going to be storing our hardware IDs. And then where's the template for that controller file. Actually, you know what? Let me just reverse the order. We'll do template second. So there you go. All right. So here's the controller file location in the MAME Lightgun subfolder controller. And then, because this is where I've installed MAME, and then the template folder for that particular file that we're replacing. Now, because of the way MAME works, we need to have unique art files specifically for the Sinden light guns. So the first thing you have to say is, where is MAME's artwork folder? It's going to be in the artwork subfolder. Now the templates, I have two of them. I have one called artwork other. These are for non-Sinden light guns, and one for Sinden light guns. So let's take a look at that. So if we go into our game folder here, I actually store the artwork alongside the emulator. It's just easier than copying it from a template directory. You can, of course, change that. So let's go to MAME Lightgun, and here you're going to see artwork other and an existing artwork directory. Now, the existing artwork directory used to be called artwork_Sinden, but if you remember in my example, I already configured the Sinden. So when I go in here, if I take a look at the different artwork, there is artwork, as you can see here, with the white border. Now, if I were to configure a gun for IR, what's going to happen is it's going to rename the other folder to the artwork folder. It's going to rename the existing artwork folder to artwork Sinden. Because in that folder, looking at the same one, you look at the bezel, and there's no white border. It's as simple as that. So it's a very trivial task there. So next we move on to reshade. Now for reshade, all we're specifying here is where are the reshade files for Sinden and non-Sinden templates. And really the file is pretty straightforward. So let's go take a look at the templates directory. So we'll go here to Integrometro, templates, and then reshade. So under other, all we do is we leave off the techniques. We don't actually use any of the reshade filters. Now, when we go to Sinden, we're just going to copy over this file, and it's going to turn on the border FX. One thing to keep in mind about the Sinden border is I've got 20 pixels as the default configuration. If you find that's too small for your setup, you can just change the values here, and that way the automation will still put up a border of whatever pixel size that you desire or need. Okay, next is the Sinden software itself. Now, I'm not going to include any third-party emulators. I'm just going to show you where to put them. So in my case here, I put the Sinden software under the Sinden Lightgun folder. And specifically, we need to edit the config file. There are some tweaks that I do to ensure that everything's working in the Sinden file. And I can go into that again a little bit later. And then finally, when we launch the Sinden software, what is the executable we're going to run? And it's going to be right here. Again, all configurable. And now finally, we move on to Teknoparrot. Now, Teknoparrot has a configuration file for every single game. Now, I've created a template folder, and again, we'll put the template folder second just for clarity. So the first thing I want to know is, hey, where does Teknoparrot keep its user profiles? And again, it's in emulators, Teknoparrot Lightgun, user profiles. And then where are the templates we're going to copy? Well, again, Integrum Retro templates Teknoparrot. So what does that look like? Well, going into templates and Teknoparrot, we'll take transformers. And so the way I create these, oh, it's opened up in the other tab again. That's not the template, that's the final one. Here's the template. Okay. Now the way I create these is I will manually configure a Lightgun game with physical Lightguns, and that will create the necessary XML assignments. Then I just simply go into the device path and then the bind renames for each of these, and I rename them to whatever signification I need. So the device path is just going to be called Lightgun 1, so I replace every instance of Lightgun 1 with the ID for the Lightgun, and then I replace the button assignment. And one way, if you're not sure what the button assignment is, it's going to be right up here. So middle button, so I just replace that with middle button. So basically, anytime you see these little triple hashtags and assignment, the code will go in and replace all of these accordingly. And that's basically how it all works. Now, the final thing is just defining the reshade files. Remember, the world needs to accommodate for the Sinden. I really hate the fact that there is a device that's been designed that you need to modify every single game to accommodate the peripheral. I really think it's kind of an old school way of thinking, and hopefully we don't have to deal with this. But there's a lot of Sinden users out there, and I was one of them, and so you have to specify all the different locations in which you're going to copy a reshade file so you can ensure that you have your precious border. All right, so that is all you really need to know. You know the command line tools, and now you know what goes into the Integrum Retro INI file. If you don't know too much about any build specifically, what you can do is just simply map the same folder structure that I'm going to provide here. Now for the third phase here, I'd like to go through the actual code itself. There's a lot of people who struggle with this. I taught myself how to code specifically to solve these problems. And I've spent, a couple years modifying and updating it. And, today I'm offering a tremendous amount more of automation. I've got an online updater. I'm working on my own version of a MAME hooker feedback integration. So there's a lot of extra value that I can add. So if you don't really want to go through all this rigmarole, again, just head to my website. I offer a great product, great automation, and great service. But everybody was a tinkerer. So was I. So I think a rising tide raises all boats. So I'd like to see if we can build more expertise for those that really want to get nitty gritty into this. So if you're ready, let's go through the source code. Now, again, so just going top down, the first thing that I did was try to hard code all the different attributes of the guns themselves. First of all, what is the gun position? What is the type of gun? And what is the HID determination, HID, VID for the gun itself. So those IDs that we populate in the config files. I just made those global variables because it was just too much of a pain to be passing things back and forth through different functions. The final one is the global guns parameter. This one is a variable that determines or saves how many guns have we detected. That's going to be very important when we start to loop through different interface devices. So the very first thing here is if you pass the debug parameter, we're going to go ahead and delete the log file and then start fresh, because obviously we're trying to run a debug session. We want to know what started there immediately. So starting here with main, we're actually never going to get to 4 parameters, but I put it there just in case. So all the basic stuff here, if you don't enter anything, or I'm going to output the credentials for who made this. And then I've got the little help menu here that will appear. So after the help menu, we have a simple switch statement in which we're just simply checking for the different command line parameters. Now, parameter number 1 is always going to be Lightgun, followed by some other kind of verb. So the goal was object verb. That was really the theory behind the command line parameter. And remember, the verbs here are start and stop for the Sinden software, a list to output the list of light guns. Notice I set the value of debug to 1 because outputting all those HIDs is really a debug statement. So I didn't want to be where you had to type in debug, and just simply typing in list didn't do anything. And then finally, the objects that we can configure. So once we prefix it, we can configure Demulshooter, MAME, and Teknoparrot. And there are unique functions for each one. Create Demulshooter config, MAME config, and then create Teknoparrot config. Notice I've also included create Demulshooter. There are instances in which you can combine Teknoparrot and Demulshooter, so say things for like MAME hookers. So I figure if we're going to do it, let's just go ahead and configure Demulshooter just in case. Now, this is something also that's been an issue. What happens if there's no light guns? So then we need to set a pop-up window. Now, I used to do the message box, but when you're running big box, the problem with that is it can actually clobber and then hide behind the pop-up screen. So you've got no guns, you hear a ding, and you're like, what's going on? And then you've got the startup screen that's locked up. But I found putting a GUI will overlay the whatever big box startup screen has, and it just simply self-destructs after a few seconds. So it gives a message to the individual that no light guns are plugged in, but it doesn't clobber the software. So going down the functions list, the very first one is the find light guns. This is really where the magic happens. This is what took the longest to try to understand. And of course, looking at all sorts of existing code, basically what we're doing is we're enumerating all of the raw input devices that are attached to the machine itself. We're filtering to see if any of those are mouse devices. And with that, once we determine that they're a mouse device, then we loop through our INI file and we see if there's any matching vendor ID PIDs to whatever mice devices that we actually see on the system. That's pretty much the summary of it. And you'll notice here that the log debug session will output whatever findings it is after it loops through the different hardware devices filter based on mouse input. So for the create MAME config, again, just simply reading the INI file, and we are replacing this is important here because when you're outputting the raw hardware IDs, you can't put ampersands inside of the MAME config file. So you have to prefix it or postfix it with ampersand AMP colon, and that will, because ampersand is a special character in MAME, and so that's kind of what makes that key. Just here checking for the controller template, you'll notice lots of different debug statements, and the only difference is we're doing a secondary check here that if any of the guns appear as Sinden, and this is what allows you to run any gun with a Sinden as well. It's kind of cool. So if you had a gun for IR, a Blamcon, an aim track, a retro shooter, you could plug in a Sinden as the second or third gun, and it will still realize to pop up a border. And so then we just simply have a create MAME artwork function that will determine which artwork that we copy over. So the creating MAME artwork, here's the code for that. Basically, and there is debug statements, so that way you know which folder you're actually doing, because if, for example, you put the images in the wrong folder, you want to kind of understand the back-end logic that's included here. So if we're checking if it's a Sinden, we're just simply replacing, if you recall, we're replacing artwork underscore Sinden with the artwork folder, or replacing artwork underscore other with the artwork folder. Again, you know, the hardest part about writing this tool, especially early on, was the accommodation for the Sinden. Oh my gosh, every single thing. Is the border up? Is the border up? Is the software started? It's just, it really made automation a lot more time consuming and difficult. So next we have the Demulshooter config. Pretty straightforward. Once we're reading the config templates from the INI file, I do some basic sanity checks to see if the files exist. We loop through the gun IDs and just simply replace, again, the triple hashtag with what's needed. Try to capture any type of issues, like if the file doesn't exist, if there's any kind of error, usually never pops up. Then the copy reshade file. This is necessary for the Teknoparrot games. Again, we're reading where the reshade locations are. So where is the template for Sinden and where is the template for other? Pretty straightforward, copies it in place. And then creating the Teknoparrot config. Again, much like MAME, you have to replace the ampersand with @ampersand, or not @ampersand, but ampersand AMP colon, because again, special characters. And then of course, making the accommodation for the Sinden, looking to see if there's a reshade file that we need to configure. Now, because what we're doing with Teknoparrot is we're configuring a lot of games at once, there's a lot of extra additional error checking. So what I'm doing is I'm going through the template folder, I'm looking at all the XML files, replacing every single one of those, the triple hashtag with the IDs and the button configurations based on the Integrum Retro INI. And so here is the logic there where you can see all the things that are replaced. Basically, we're only replacing 4 items. We're replacing the hardware vendor ID. We're replacing the description. That's what the Lightgun 1 name is. Then we're replacing the 3 possible button assignments. Now, I know we're getting into more possible. Some guns could have a 4th button, especially say for Time Crisis 5, in which you actually need 4 active buttons versus a trigger right and middle. So this could be easily modified for that. I've only kind of hard-coded these 3 parameters for the time being. Now for the Sinden software, it's not just as simple as starting and stopping the Sinden software. Some of the issues that a lot of people run into with the Sinden software is they don't have the button config set properly. So I decided to just do that without them knowing. I'm setting off-screen reload. I'm setting the front and right buttons for the middle and right button as they should be, so on and so forth. So you can kind of look at the XML, and the great thing is now they have a single XML file instead of 1 for each gun. It's very simple, just replaces that. The big thing here is you got to wait, right? You can't just move forward before the Sinden software has officially set up. So for some reason, it takes a few seconds to get going. So the sleep statement I found was actually the most important part. And then some other real simple stuff, stopping Demulshooter, looking for a process and closing whatever we could find. You could do the kill command as well, but I do find that this is just as good. Stopping the Sinden software. And then a special function for all of the debug data. So what the logic is happening here is basically as I'm sending out log debugs, so if you do log debug, it's specifying what the category of log is, whether it be info, warn, error, or debug. And so with the log level, all it's doing is here it's checking if it's a debug message, then we will output it. But if you have not set debug, which is a global variable, then it will just simply ignore those messages. So it just keeps the log files a little cleaner. And again, like I said, I taught myself how to do this. I coded all this in Notepad++. I'm not even using an IDE. I'd like to learn that. If somebody is really good at this stuff, I'd like to learn what I don't know. So really, I just hope that this benefits the community and kind of gets you that one step closer. And, if you could, please acknowledge some of the work and maybe we can collaborate on some future endeavors. Enjoy.